In such a place, a promise becomes a weapon both immediate and irreversible. The general, an old man of rank, secure in service and swollen with entitlement, steps into that vacuum. He petitions for the princess. The court falls silent. Xerxes, either out of intoxicated rashness, a need to save face after drink and praise, or a deeper unwillingness to expose himself to the charge of breaking his word, whether for personal vanity or because ritual obligated him, answers with the fatal assent. Granted. There is a simple cruelty to the bureaucratic inevitability of that moment. In the palace, words create obligations that cannot be undone by remorse. A vow made in public binds not just the speaker, but the institutions that uphold him. For a young girl of 14, who spent her childhood in a world of ritualized seclusion and surveillance, such a public transfer is catastrophic because it reassigns not merely property, but personhood. The narrative that follows, held together by Herodotus's account and conjectures based on fragmentary administrative evidence, charts how the outward splendor of court life masked an inward system of coercion. The marriage itself was a spectacle designed to confirm the general's new status and to display the king's largesse. Sources describe satin and jewels, though we must be cautious about the exact verbs and adjectives that later storytellers embroidered around the scene. What matters is less the finery than the ceremony's function, to make the transfer irreversible in the eyes of the court and the empire. Official protocol rearranged the daughter's life in a single day. She was moved, isolated, and assigned households that answered to her new husband to will. The men who once served her father now had to answer to Artabanus's authority, and the girl's biological family ties were formally, and for practical purposes, functionally, severed. Isolation was the first instrument of control. The sources suggest that she was kept apart from her natal kin, that her movements were tightly policed, and that her attendants were loyal to the household of her husband rather than to her own family. Administrative tablets that record payments for palace staff or for particular specialists occasionally give us the outline of patterns: stipends for women of the palace, remuneration for those who attended births, payments to physicians who attempted interventions. These bureaucratic traces show the machinery that sustained a royal woman's body as an instrument of dynastic continuity. They do not sanctify those arrangements. Instead, they underline how a system that had the resources to attempt to secure a succession also had the capacity to reduce a person to the function of childbearing. Reproductive coercion in this context must be understood not as an isolated cruelty, but as statecraft.
For men like Artabanus, marriage to the king's daughter could legitimize claims, secure alliances, and provide avenues to power otherwise inaccessible. Producing an heir would cement such claims. Sources recount, in sober and sometimes clinical terms, the engagement of midwives and physicians after the marriage, payments for treatments meant to induce fertility, and the sustained expectation that the young princess would perform the central duty assigned to her new role. The instruments of care were thus instruments of pressure. Midwives and physicians worked under the same institutional hierarchy. Their records, where they exist, read like receipts for interventions whose primary beneficiary was the lineage and social order, not the woman whose body was intervened upon. According to Herodotus, she did become pregnant. That is one of the few narrative points where multiple strands of the tradition now converge. A child was born in the palace. Some accounts emphasize the secrecy that surrounded the delivery. Others stress the immediate and public nature of the event. What follows is where the historical record slips into uncertainty and rumor. Some sources claim the infant died shortly after birth. Others suggest the child survived only days. More heinous allegations, which appear in later retellings and in offhand gossip recorded by chroniclers with partisan agendas, hint at deliberate neglect or violence. The careful historian must say plainly, such allegations remain unproven. They circulate as rumor in sources that often use scandal to explain political motives. Administrative tablets, because they are concerned with money and logistics, record payments for midwives or for funerary arrangements in a way that registers an outcome without providing motive or method. Thus, the fact of an infant's death, while supported by fragmentary evidence in some accounts, never resolves the question of how or why. The consequences for the princess were not merely the immediate horror of losing a child. Traumatic birth and infant death, whatever their proximate causes, were devastating within a culture that equated female value with reproductive success in the dynastic context. Reports suggest a progressive withdrawal from court life. Music that once was tolerated now injured her like glass. Ceremonies became sites of unbearable memory. Once familiar faces became instruments of surveillance and blame. The sources differ on details, but they consistently indicate a woman whose public persona was hollowed out. Some later writers, writing under the influence of scandal-hungry genres, described a breakdown that had elements of sickness, despair, and disaffection. Modern readers may be tempted to impose contemporary psychiatric labels, but the evidence does not support firm clinical claims. What can be said with historical confidence is that the princess's capacity to participate in court life diminished, and her isolation deepened.
But the private suffering did not remain isolated. Over the ensuing years, the aging general, who had been granted the princess, accrued power and resentment, and the delicate balances of court politics shifted. Some accounts suggest that he used the fact of his marriage to the king's daughter as rhetorical ammunition in a bid for greater authority, implying that the wrongs he had suffered in service justified his ambitions. There is a point here where rumor and recorded political maneuver converge. The personal became political. Artabanus's increased assertiveness culminated in an episode that some sources classify as an attempted seizure of power, a coup that briefly placed him in a commanding position. These events are messy in the record. Herodotus and later chroniclers give us a narrative of rebellion and swift, violent retribution. Administrative fragments, where they survive, point to payments and sudden reassignments of personnel consistent with upheaval, but do not narrate loyalty and betrayal in human terms. Whatever the exact mechanics, the coup failed in the end. The aging general met execution, tabled under the swift justice of imperial reassertion or factional revenge, depending on which account you read. His downfall did not restore what had been taken. The princess returned to a court that had recorded her only as a symbol and a problem. Attempts at political rehabilitation by successive rulers, perhaps enacted to symbolically repair the rupture of her honor or to stabilize factional divisions, appear in the record as small conditional acts: restored stipends, token ceremonies, a guarded reintegration into palace life. Yet the person who returned was not the same girl who had entered the marriage at 14. Contemporary accounts and the scant traces in palace record-keeping indicate a long-term decline in the princess's health and agency. At this juncture, the historian must tread carefully between what is recorded and what has been inferred. Some later narrators expanded the story into tragedy and moral theater, claiming that the princess withdrew into a world where music made her ill, where she sat mute, and where she let the light of life dim. Such images are powerful but must be qualified as literary shaping. They are not neutral data. What we can more reliably assert is that the princess's public roles were truncated. The court stopped treating her as a political asset with potential for alliance, and instead catalogued her as a dependent, an expense perhaps, and ultimately a marginal figure in the palace ledger. The empire that carved its deeds into stone, monuments inscribed to perpetuate dynastic glories, left no comparable stone for this girl. Her suffering, such as it was recorded in small entries and in rumor, not grand memorials. This discrepancy points to the deeper, dark secret that the title suggests. Empires preserve the narratives that justify them: triumphal inscriptions, lists of conquered peoples, tallies of tribute. They do not preserve the inconvenient intimacies of violence at home. The King's Oath, a performance intended to weave honor into the fabric of rule, had an afterlife that undercut the very majesty that produced it. The public oath enhanced the king's image in the moment. It also made him, by institutional force, complicit in a personal catastrophe. Whether Xerxes intended this consequence or not is impossible to determine from the fragmentary sources. The more important and historically demonstrable point is that the structures of honor, ritual, and male privilege made such consequences possible and then obscured them. When we read the sources, Herodotus's narrative voice, the clipped registers of administrative tablets, the later chroniclers who sometimes thickened the tale into moral parable, we see a pattern repeated across empires. Political spectacle demands stories that glorify. The more a ruler performs inviolability, the more he becomes trapped by the performance. The king's granted was not merely a private promise, it was a public transaction that redistributed power and personhood. What the state then did, what courts and households did, was to reify that distribution, to create a new, legally and socially enforced reality that the young woman had to inhabit. The result is an ethical indictment not of one man alone, but of a culture that allowed honor to trump humanity. We must also consider how rumors filled the gaps left by official silence. Faced with little direct evidence about private events, later authors and the whisper networks of court correspondence invented explanations to make sense of the visible outcomes: a deaf infant, a general's ambition, a princess's decline.
To some, the simplest narrative, that the infant died of natural causes and that the princess suffered grief, was insufficient. Others proposed more sinister possibilities. We cannot endorse those conjectures as facts, but we can study the fact of the rumors themselves as evidence about political culture. Gossip is a form of social negotiation when formal records are incomplete. Scandal functions as a weapon and a currency. The existence of slanderous or horrific stories about the infant's death tells us less about what actually happened than about the anxieties and moral languages of contemporaries who sought to explain or weaponize domestic tragedy into political capital. Another important archaeological and documentary point is how administrative tablets, the empire's financial memory, register people and events. These tablets are not meant to be intimate biographies. They track stipends, requisitions, and official expenses. Yet those dry lines of cuneiform often supply the most reliable proof that a person existed in a particular institutional capacity.
When a tablet records payment to a midwife or the allocation of grain to a household, it anchors fragments of narrative to the reality of bureaucratic life. It also underscores a grim truth. The same institutions that recorded and rationalized care could also be mechanisms of control. Recording an expense is not an act of compassion, it is a form of management. The princess's slow decline after the political storm raises another set of questions about power and memory. How does a state remember those who threaten its image? The empire commemorates victories and legal reforms. It rarely preserves the testimonies of those who suffered at its hand. This absence is itself evidence of power's unequal grammar. The stories that remain, Herodotus's account, the occasional fragment of a tablet, a later chronicler's moralistic aside, show us not a full biography, but a silhouette. That silhouette is enough, however, to indict the systems that facilitate such tragedies: absolutism, ritualized honor, patriarchal control. In the final phase of this story, the princess dies. The causes cited in various accounts are multiple and contested. Some say protracted illness, others suggest a broken spirit, and still others cast the end as a quiet, unremarked extinguishing. The historian must resist tidy moralizing. Death in antiquity often had multiple causes and complex social contingencies. It is plausible that years of isolation, trauma, and the stresses of enforced reproduction contributed to a decline that culminated in death. It is also plausible that her end was treated indifferently by an empire more concerned with stability than with the fate of a single, now inconvenient royal woman. The critical point is that her disappearance from the grand narratives of the empire is typical rather than exceptional. So what is the darkest secret of Xerxes? It is not necessarily a single suppressed text or a dramatic confession suddenly unearthed. The darkest secret is structural. It is this, that the public acts of honor that buttressed imperial rule could, in their wake, commit private violence. That a ruler's need to appear unbreakable made him sometimes complicit in the erasure of those he was supposed to protect. That bureaucratic records can register a person only as a function or expense, while monuments record only the glory the state wishes to preserve. This story, sharpened in Herodotus, blurred in administrative fragments, darkened by rumor, reveals how monarchic power produced and tolerated cruelty in the name of image. This is not merely an ancient tale, it is a historical mirror. Across time and culture, spectacles and public vows have often protected the image of rulers at the expense of intimate human lives. Empires build narratives that serve them. Individuals, especially women in dynastic households, often end up as collateral damage in those narratives.
Remembering the princess requires both empathy and detachment. Empathy for the human life hidden behind the ledger lines, and detachment to read the sources critically, to label rumor as rumor, and to place each fragment where it responsibly belongs. As we close this account, note one last paradox. Monuments preserve the king's greatness. Small, unadorned tablets preserve the logistical backstage. The human story, the girl taken by a public promise, her child's contested fate, her decline, and the fleeting violence of a failed coup survives only as a set of margins. An oath recorded by a narrative historian, a few disjointed administrative entries, a rumor in a later chronicle. The empire remembers what it chooses to remember. The princess, whose life was reshaped by one word uttered in a hall full of light, remains in those margins. That is the secret. The great machinery of state can make a life vanish by refusing to dignify it with an account worthy of its sorrow. If this moved you, tell us in the comments which empire or historical figure we should investigate next. And if you haven't already, subscribe to follow more stories where power's private costs meet the public record.